stuck in a mirror.
So it never changes.
Out of charcoal, no less.
All right, so we are moving a lot slower than initially planned, but whatever, that's okay. Here's the thing with all this stuff: we could spend 6 to 10 weeks on each week that we do, and we're just scratching the surface. And every week we're just opening up new cans of worms. And so, what we want to do tonight, though, is we want to try to finish up the Deuterocanonicals that we had worked on, started. So I revised this every single week. we keep adding weeks to them, and that means we keep deleting or changing the ones below it. So we'll see where we get. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at the work of the Spirit, starting from the Torah, Genesis again. But today, we want to pick up back where we are, dealing with Revelation, Inspiration, and Canon. Functional authority is not canonical authority. It's going to show up on multiple slides probably, and that's kind of going to be a tagline as we are dealing with the Deuterocanonical books. So the point of that is that there's different types of authority in life, and there's different levels and hierarchies of the influence or the importance of different things. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. It can be important, and it can function in a influential way, and it can hold sway, but it doesn't have to be the ultimate authority or whatever. So we have all of these in our lives. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes here as well. And so, let's see. I'm actually not going to go through most of this, but we are going to talk about at the end, the bottom here, Ben Sira. That's the guy that we brought up from Sirach, Deuterocanonical book, a couple weeks ago. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. In the issue of the debate of the canon, one of the things that I think is very important for us to understand is there's continually, 2,000 years later, they're still debating what was the Old Testament canon, when was the New Testament canon solidified, etc. One of the things that I think is important to understand is that there were debates about the peripheral issues and some of the books in the periphery. There was not much debate about the core. And so when we talk with the Old Testament specifically, we can start with like the Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy. There was next to no debate about Genesis to Deuteronomy. The only debate is when the final written form was finally completed. Some people say it's after the return from Babylon, so the Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther type period, Second Temple period, and others would say, much sooner than that. But my point here is that the core was pretty solid fairly early on, and I think the same can be said about the New Testament as well. And so that I think should help us a little bit along the way when we're dealing with that. The 1, 2, 3 here, the categories and the descriptions are related to the same topic. So the first is that canonically authoritative and normative for doctrine. So that's going to be the canon, the Bible. So we would call that the 66 books we have. Intertextually and hermeneutically significant for fuller understanding, but not doctrinally normative. That's going to be the Deuterocanonical books. Okay, that's our position. Now that's not going to be the position of the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or the Ethiopian Church, because they're going to include some of those other books in number 1 that we're putting in number 2. And then 3, historically important but not doctrinally normative or hermeneutically necessary for understanding Scripture. That's Josephus, Philo, etc. Useful for background information. There can be a blurring between numbers 2 and 3, and, well, more than that, as I just said, different groups of people would put stuff that we would put in 2 into number 1. And so part of how you read the Bible has to do with decisions about this, and to be even more blunt, how you read the Bible has a whole lot to do with all the things that go into who you are. And so before we jump into the Deuterocanonical books, that's actually what I want to talk about for just a minute. So this is another cool diagram that AI made for me. And so if I were to ask you, some of the answers are on the board, but they're just headers. It's not fully explained there. If I were to ask you, when you open up the Bible and you read a portion of Scripture, what are all of the things that are unseen, subconscious, that are influencing how you are reading that? We could spend the next hour on this, but I don't have time. Anybody have
like history
off the top of your head? Yes. What else? What are some other things? We'll mention. Don't take the ones on the board because they're already on the board. But the things you say will fit. They'll fit into it.
Prophecy would be another.
How so?
Predicted events.
How do you know about that?
What's been shared, what's been told.
Okay. And who's sharing and telling you that?
Writers of the book.
Outside of the Bible.
I think things that are interesting.
Historians.
Okay. So historians that you may have read.
Theologians.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, things that are interesting, things that capture your interest like prophecy. So I don't like to read like the boring laws.
We won't tell Moses you said that.
They don't relate to us. So why am I reading this? That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
But I like the New Testament. I like the history, but I like the New Testament better than the Old Testament because it's more relative, I think, to us today.
Gotcha.
So that's why I read.
Okay, so when you're reading it, so when you open up your New Testament, or you open up and you're talking about prophecy, or you're reading Revelation, or you're reading one of the Old Testament prophets, or you're reading in Matthew, and it says this is what was written, right, by the prophets. So that's prophecy connected to the Old Testament, right? So here's the deal. When you're reading that, and somebody in Africa is reading that, and someone in China is reading that same verse, in a different translation, obviously, are they thinking the same thing as you are?
Probably not.
Probably not. So who's right?
We are.
Ethnocentrism. There we go. So that becomes a very important issue that we don't often open up or discuss. In hermeneutics books, they'll talk about this. They'll talk about the fact that you can't really ever be completely objective when you read something because you already have a whole worldview and mindset when you're approaching it. And so, now...
Every time I read it a second time, I get a better understanding of what I knew before.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think if people are at different levels of their understanding of their reading, some are just going to know more relative to someone else.
That's all true also. So, which is why we can read it more frequently, right? So, as an American, growing up in the West, okay, these are a bunch of influences that, whether you recognize it or not, have already predisposed you to certain ways of reading the scriptures. So, look at the bottom half. Okay, specifically. The top ones are things that go into how the Bible was made. The bottom ones are things that are specific to us in the American West.
Into their way of thinking?
What's that?
Are you saying that they have guided us in how we should think?
I don't know if should be included in that,
Okay,
but yes.
fair enough, yeah.
So yes, these have all influenced, guided. They are the backdrop to what we are thinking when we read this, which is why someone in Africa or China or Latin America might read the same passage and not think the same thing. So, English Bible translations, we can just tag that one for a second. You can do a survey, this has been done, there's books on this, of just the influence of the King James Bible alone in our Western culture. Doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. It has influenced every aspect of Western American culture. So, like it or not, and whether the translation was accurate in that verse or not relevant to my point here, it's entrenched in everything. Western Enlightenment and rationalism. Okay, so the idea of scientific empiricism, the idea of facts over faith. I'm painting with a broad brushstroke right now. All of these things are part of our Western culture. And so if you grew up going through some of them, you would see the changes in the culture. But most of us don't live long enough because we live long enough to go through parts of it, but not long enough to see like the full trajectory often. Because it's usually multiple generations that this whole thing unfolds over. The American evangelical culture. The American evangelical culture is unlike almost any other culture. The closest is Britain because some of it came out of Britain. So there's just a movie that just came out, and I'll see it. I think Light and Sound, whatever. Sight and Sound. Yes, I think at Easter it came out.
The Great Awakening.
The Great Awakening. Yes, I think that's the one. It was in theaters for just a couple of days at Easter time. So the Great Revivals, the Great Awakening, that spread through America. The works of Whitfield, then you've got Finney, then you've got Moody, all this type of stuff massively influences the American Christian landscape, which is not the same as in another country. Denominations and theological formations. The last one is the digital information age. The Protestant Reformation is up there. And then there's also a second one of these that if you throw in the Catholic influence, because actually the Catholics were here before the Puritans and Pilgrims were here, with their priests and evangelists particularly in Florida. New England areas, Florida areas, Great Lakes area, western side as well. So they were here 100 plus years before. Mm-hmm.
Are these in order? The most influence down to the least? Or are they just...
The amount of influence is based on the height of the...
Color.
So you're
Yep.
saying
So
the digital is less than all the rest?
Well, because it's so new. That's only been in the
I
last...
would think that'd be high right now.
It's not. If you look at the 250 years of American history or whatever,
Yeah.
it would not be as influential though as the Protestant.
It's early in its development,
Yeah.
maybe.
I think it's gonna be
Yes.
the highest.
Yeah. So to piggyback on that, if you were to look at this, the Protestant Reformation and the American evangelical culture, which piggybacks off the Protestant Reformation, you just put those together, and then you add the Roman Catholic tradition and then denominational and theological formations. It's a lot of religion right there, right? So heavily influences all sorts of things, and I don't even know that. I don't really see politics.
Yeah.
They don't have politics on there, but what?
Patristic. What is that? The blue one.
Yeah. So that's the councils, creeds and councils. So the point with this is simply that as we approach the text, even the words we use, the terminology we use, is all based on stuff often hundreds of years old that we say. So when we approach the Gospels and we're looking at them and we're talking about, we don't even really question the idea of Jesus being God. But for 100 years, that was argued about in the Christian circles. Like, was he? How is this? Like, how does that work? But we're so far removed from that to us, it's just an automatic known fact. Think of, to make a analogy, think of how those who have been involved in the proponents of evolutionary theory view things and speak. It's not theory anymore. It's not hypotheses. It's facts. It's been so established in their mind and in their institutions and in their scientific endeavors that what are you talking about, Kevin? You're obviously very unenlightened, Kevin, to say that or question it being a fact. You know what I'm saying? And so we do the same thing though when we go into the scriptures. Again, I'm not saying Jesus isn't God. I'm just saying that when we read them, we don't even really stop to analyze that because it's so deep and entrenched into this which creates us. Whereas in another country...
Does this correlate in any way to the growth in Christianity peaking, or I don't know how to ask the question. If I look at that graph and I see a large space, does that mean Christianity was necessarily peaking at that time, or just the discussion of it, or the understanding of it?
Well, this doesn't have any time frames on here, really. So it's basically saying 21st century, what has been funneled into your background to do what you're talking about, we would then take this and break that apart over time, and we would see these different things. And you would see that during the Great Awakening, lots of people became followers of Christ, and there was this great revival movements, and you would see these different things peak like that, and you would be able to see what those influences are. And so this, though, that doesn't have dates. This is just meant to show, because we're going to get into, the whole point of this is simply for you to grasp an aspect and to think about, well, why do I think this way, and what influences theological, church, political, all these things, like politics. Politics influences your interpretation of the scriptures. So, all of that, because that is going to be important for the Deuterocanonical that we're looking at. So, when we look at these Deuterocanonical books and then how they connect with the New Testament, which there's 3 passages we want to look at tonight, at least that's the goal. Okay, so remember this here, what we're doing is the Deuterocanonical books, okay, are here, and Enoch and Jubilees in particular are this one here. And what we had said 2 weeks ago was that if these books, Deuterocanonical, but especially like Enoch and Jubilees, if they're part of the scriptures, the canon, okay, then you can see what this spike does right here. Alright? This is back to our charts that we did, SAD, ENFI, and all that type of stuff. So, going through the scriptures, the way the scriptures ends for us in the Old Testament is that the Old Testament ends on a note here, and the Gospels are Revelation, Epistles, Gospels, and so it's coming down, all right? But if this is part of the canon, or supposed to be, right, then we have a huge spike right here in the storyline. And the reason this is a big spike like this is Enoch and Jubilees are heavily about appearances, God, primarily angels, huge angelic activity. And then for Enoch, Enoch going to heaven, getting all this information, relaying it back and forth, angels, the watchers, and all this type of stuff. And so that changes the revelation mode and the trajectory of the storyline. And so these are the books right now that we're looking at with the question of, should they be? Shouldn't they be? Why aren't they? All right. And then this will be in the slide deck again, so you can look at it. But the S is for the books that have a strong connection. Over on the left is your Deuterocanonicals. So a strong connection with Old Testament books, and then strong connection with New Testament books. All right, and so we want to look at 3 passages tonight. Okay, one from Sirach, Wisdom, and 2 Maccabees. Okay, and so you can see that there's a strong connection in Matthew, another one in Romans, Corinthians, Ephesians, is that? So all of these have strong connections with passages in the New Testament. And so we're wanting to know, well, what kind of connection is that? You're saying, well, what does that mean, Kevin? Because if they're not inspired, so that's the whole funnel thing. So I wanted you to first understand the things that influence you, and we didn't even unpack it. We really need to spend an hour to really be confirmed in ourselves of how much these things are impacting us, right? So when I read a book, one of the first things I do before I read a book, when I'm looking at a book, first thing I do is I read the author's little 5 sentences they put on the back of a book usually. I want to know, where is this guy either a pastor at or usually a professor at? Because you can't tell everything. And I don't mean to pigeonhole, but you can quickly tell, if they're at a Reformed school, then, they're going to be thinking these things. And if they're at an Anglican school, they're going to be thinking these things. So I'm quickly finding out, and it doesn't matter where they're from, that doesn't completely determine if I buy or read the book, but it tells me what perspective they're going to be coming from because of all this stuff right here. Because you don't, a Southern Baptist is not going to get hired at a Catholic university to teach theology, right? Or vice versa. All right. So now we move then from what is going on that created how we think and interpret to our topic, and that's these books. So as you get into the New Testament era, what was coming all along behind them that was shaping these people and how they thought? And that's what we have here. And so every one of these areas is an area that honestly most Christians don't know much about, which is why you got to read books or listen to lectures or watch YouTube or something, right? Because you have to fill yourself in on understanding the background and the culture of what's going on here. And that's normally how we approach it. We're like, well, it's background and culture. So if you really want to understand it, you should read some on the background and culture. And I agree with all that. But it's a little bit beyond that. Because whether you read the background and culture or not, these guys were all brought up in it. And so how they think and talk is related to that. So, Babylonian exile. So this happens in 586, 587 BC. All right, so Judah is sent off to Babylon. The Persian Restoration. Here's how you can remember. A brief pause. God is ready. This is the empires. Okay, so Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece. Israel had slight independence, so you can put Israel or you can put independence, and then Rome. These are the empires that go through from the Old Testament time into the New Testament time. So Rome is still all through the New Testament, and prior to Jesus is Rome. All right, so this is what's going on here. And so here you've got the Babylonians. Now, when you get taken and you get uprooted, and so you get put into another country, and you're there for generations,
you learn their culture
completely, and your kids are totally brought up in that culture. Now, let's make an analogy to for immigrants here. When that happens, usually you'll see, so the first generation that moves there, they want to hold on to their culture. They're going to teach their kids and their grandkids if they can. At the same time, each successive generation is going to adopt more and more of the culture that they live in. So it's the first, second, third generation missionary thing that we see all over the place. And we see it here as well. And so that happens there. The Persian period, and this is Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah. Esther is in Persia, right? The whole story takes place in Persia. All right, so they come back. This is when the Second Temple period is going to begin. They're going to get the temple rebuilt. It's not going to be as nice as Solomon's, etc. And so at this time period, they're coming back from having lived in Persia. Everybody doesn't come back. Why don't they all come back? I mean, Israel, we should go back to the homeland, right? Well, they don't all come back. So some of them liked it in Persia, right? Some of them got wealthy in Persia. Some didn't. So you have this whole group. So some don't come back from Babylon. Some don't come back from Persia. The Hellenistic conquest under Alexander. So this brings Greece, culture, language, everything, all over the whole world. And then to combine that with this, which are the biggest influences in everything we're going to talk about, the Romans brought the roads. And the roads made everything so much quicker. And so everything gets spread quick. And so all of these things are feeding into all the stuff that's written in between, so the intertestamental, the apocryphal books, or the deuterocanonical books, and then also this feeds into the New Testament books themselves being written. To add to that, you have the Maccabean Revolt, we're going to talk about in just a second. The Ptolemies and Seleucids, those are the offsprings of after Alexander dies. He has 4 generals. All the land gets split into the 4 generals, but then they war back and forth. Ptolemy is in Egypt, and Seleucids are, so they're in the west. if you take a map of Israel, so Ptolemy is over here in Egypt. That's not how you spell it, but whatever.
You need
Ptolemy.
to pick a different color next time.
And
Thank you.
Just for you, Steve.
the solutions are so west and east, okay? And they both want this land, okay? So everybody always wants that. So all of those. So Alexander dies, 4 generals take his land, that gets split up, and then there's warring between the 4 generals, that gets consolidated, and then as other empires overtake this, Rome, then they dethrone some and put some of their own, etc., etc. And then the scribal traditions. So when we don't have the temple, what do? Everything in Judaism centered around the temple. Like without a temple, there's nothing. So what happens? Well, the synagogues become very important. The scribes become more important. And the teaching becomes based in the synagogues, and the scribes become the authorities and the keepers of the scrolls, and that's how by the time you get to the New Testament, they have all this authority that wasn't quite the same previously. And so all of that is going on. Then during this time period also, they're wondering, when they're sent into exile here and here, well, not there, they're coming back, but here and then before this with Assyrian exile and then Babylonian exile, they're wondering, well, how does this work? I thought we were God's chosen people. Now we're living in a foreign land, and so, like, how do the scriptures make sense of this, and what do we do? And so a whole new era of literature grew up. Part of that is the wisdom and apocalyptic literature. So the wisdom literature is, how do we live in Babylon? How do we live in Persia as God's elect children, but not in the promised land, not with the temple, not with anything that is supposed to be what we're doing, right? And so that's what they're trying to think through. And so that creates a whole bunch of literature of them trying to figure out how to do this. And the apocalyptic aspect is dealing with, what does the future look like? So how do we live in with and deal with the future when we are under oppressors? When, like, we're supposed to be a nation with the Creator as our king, but we're all being oppressed. And that doesn't go away, because it's Assyria, Babylon. Persia was a little nicer, but Greece and Rome. So they're constantly in this situation. And so all of this is going on. And the diaspora and the Septuagint, which we've mentioned the Septuagint before, but starting around 250 BC, the Torah was translated into Greek. And that happened because of the Hellenism. So, generation 1, generation 2 starts knowing more and more Greek. Generation 3, 4, pretty soon, people aren't knowing Hebrew. It's Greek, everywhere, Greek. Well, we need the scriptures then, and so they start translating them, and so they have them in Greece, in Greek. Greece also, but in Greek. And so, all of this is feeding into. You can do that once. Yeah. Let me do that again. That's all feeding into what is going on. So, when Paul writes, all right, all of this is the background for it. Okay? So, Paul knows all of this stuff. And just like you would know, or you're taught American history in school, well, the Jews are taught about the Maccabean revolt, because it's a critical thing that takes place and helps lead to some Israel independence during this time period. And so all of that is what feeds into Deuterocanonical books and the New Testament. And so what happens is, in every one of these situations, you get people that are always deciding, just like we are today, how do you deal as a Christian with the culture. Are you against the culture? Are you for the culture? Or are you some kind of middle road? They're always the same thing. Am I for Rome, against Rome, or some kind of middle road? Or Greece, or Babylon, or whoever. And so that's how all of these groups develop. And so these are more passive, these are more aggressive. So by the time you get to the New Testament, you got zealots, they want to kill the Romans. You got Pharisees and Essenes, they're the more passive group. All right, we get down here, the Sadducees, they have the political power. The Pharisees, they have the people power. They're anti-Rome. They're not as much like the Zealots, though, trying to physically kill them and hiding in the bushes along the roads, right? The tax collectors, well, clearly they decide to work with Rome, right? The Sanhedrin is this Jewish council that gains a very large amount of power, and these people all come into play if you read the Passion story, right? About Rome could not have crucified Christ without these groups being involved. The Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the scribes, the high priest, they all brought Jesus, and they're the ones that had him crucified. So, that is just a super quick overview so that we can get into the first of the three texts that we probably won't be able to finish because it's 7:26. So, the Maccabees, okay? Chapters 6 and 7 of 2nd Maccabees. There's 4 of the Maccabees groups of texts, okay?
Ask a stupid question. Who's
Yeah.
the Maccabees?
Yes,
Is that a name? Is it a person? Is it a group?
it is. In 1 second, I'll answer that on the next slide. So, the books of Maccabees, of which there's 4, okay? The first 2 are in the Catholic Bibles, all right? The first is a historical chronicle of events, all right? The second is a theological history of events, okay? You can see right here who includes them, okay? Third is a historical novella, unrelated to the revolt, only the Orthodox have it. Fourth, it's an Orthodox appendix, okay? And it expands on 2nd Maccabees 6 to 7, which is the 2 chapters we're going to talk about in just a moment here. So, they're not the same. They're not even in the same genre of literature. First and second deal with historical aspects of what took place with the Maccabees, which is why it's called Maccabees. Maccabees were a group of people, okay? Mattathias was the daddy, all right? And there's his boys, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, all right? And then Simon, this is only a partial family tree of some of the most important ones as they unravel things throughout the intertestamental time period, okay? We are going to focus on just the top for the time being because we don't really have time. So, Mattathias, during the time period of the, let's see, let me go back to here. Alright, so the Maccabean Revolt is 167 to 164 BC. Okay? And so this is after Alexander and after his generals. And his generals are fighting the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids on the east. And this whole situation arises over offerings made to other gods. It's always a touchy point, and most of the time, most of the rulers gave the Jews a pass that they did not give to anybody else about offering to their gods. So the Romans did also. Like, it was only the Jews pretty much that got a free pass on this. And anytime they tried to push it too far, there was always a revolt or a rebellion that always led to massive bloodshed, and it never was to the Romans' advantage. I mean, they might have crushed them, but it was not ever good for the kingdom, for politics, for peace, etc. Which is why you see in all the Jesus movies the dilemma that Pilate is dealing with. and that
Trying to control it, yeah.
yes, and he knows that if he doesn't, Rome will get rid of him because Rome does not want uprisings, and this is not a new thing. It's been going on for centuries with the Jewish people. Okay, so let me go back to here. All right, so what happens is that it's similar. Do you remember the story in the Old Testament where Phineas spears a couple while they're having sex in their tent? If you didn't know that was in the Bible, you can go look it up. So, Phineas has a reputation of being a righteous and zealous for God. Alright? And you'd be like, well, what does that have to do with it? Well, you have to go read the story. A similar thing takes place here. So, they're being told, and the rulers have sent in soldiers to tell them not only to pay taxes, but you need to offer your offerings and you need to sacrifice to our gods. And they have enough of it. And so he kills the guard and the Jew that was willing to sacrifice, and he takes his sons, and then they run to the hills. And this begins the Maccabean revolt that goes on for 3 or 4 years. And they become heroes. They would have been in your AI generated poster thing there with you, Glenn. Okay, they become the heroes of the day, and they are legendary. And this is why they would still be known in the first century New Testament time period, and everybody would have known about them. Just like everybody in America knows about Washington and Paul Revere and all that type of stuff. Same thing. And so all of that is in the back of this. So here's a little bit in the book of 2 Maccabees, chapters 6 and 7. So well, this is the end of it. But so I gave you the background. Then this is the passage that is then going to connect with resurrection in the New Testament. So Eleazar and the 7 brothers. So the older scribe Eleazar refuses to pretend to eat pork. So they were being made to eat pork. Some of the Jews would do it. Some would not do it. They were being killed. This was a time period. Like I said, most of the rulers, most of the time, tried to not provoke them too far. But there's several, like Antiochus Epiphanes. Like he went and put gods in their temple, sacrificed a pig there. There's a time where circumcision was forbidden, and if you were caught circumcising, they would kill you, which to the Jews, that is the sign of the covenant. So to not circumcise is to be killed by God, if you will, but to circumcise is to be killed by your rulers and oppressors. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place, literally, and so just like in every situation, some do what the oppressors say, some refuse, and then you got people that are trying to hide or figure out what to do in the middle, right? So, the older scribe Eleazar refuses to pretend to eat pork, saying, "Such pretense is not worthy of our time of life. For many young people would suppose that Eleazar in his 90th year had gone over to an alien religion." So the guy's 90 years old, and he's refusing to pretend to eat the pork to not get in trouble. So, there's 7 brothers, and they die in sequence, each declaring resurrection as his basis for accepting death rather than recanting. "You dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws." Verse 14, "One cannot but choose to die at the hands of men, and to cherish the hope that God gives of being raised again by him." Verse 23, "The creator of the world will in his mercy give life and breath back to you again." Now, if you've never read this before, but you're familiar with the Old Testament, you'll know immediately there's nothing even close to this in the Old Testament about resurrection. Not even close.
Yeah, it was jumping out at me. Yeah, I get you.
Right. So, normally, because most Protestants don't know about Maccabees, you go from Old Testament to New Testament, and all of a sudden we've got resurrection talk. They're like, well, where is this coming from? And they're like, well, there's little hints of it in Daniel and here and there. It was more than hints. Again, it doesn't have to be in the scripture for it to have influenced the background. They all knew Maccabees. This is heroic, legendary material. And so resurrection wasn't a brand new idea when the New Testament rolls around.
They would have had to have been believing it at the time. So
Mhm.
what would have been
Yeah.
their basis for that understanding then?
So that all came up because of this aspect of them trying to figure out what to do in this time period when they are deported, then brought back, no temple, then rebuilding a temple. And so in those hundreds of years, like this didn't all happen overnight. It's hundreds of years, which again is longer than we've even been around as a country, right? So that's the time frame that this is simmering, if you will. It's like a stew, right? So all these things are thrown in and they're simmering, and these are the things that then become what leads to or feeds into that. So this is your stew after you throw all your stuff in it, right? And so that's what's going on, and that's what's in people's minds. It gets even more interesting when we talk about Jesus himself, because Jesus was brought up in this same culture, so he would have learned all this stuff also. All right, back to here. All right. So the Maccabees. So Maccabees is connected to numerous things. They're connected to Hebrews with the Hall of Faith. They're connected to ideas of resurrection in the Gospels, and several other places as well. And so here, I just want to show a few things here. The most explicit reference here, in New Testament, Hebrews 11:35 says, "Others were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life." Now, if you don't know Maccabees, you might just think that's talking about Old Testament people. That's how it's normally presented. But if the background of Maccabees is understood and accepted, then, again, it doesn't have to be canon. Then there's already ideas of resurrection which are not clear in the Old Testament. And so Maccabees would be the backdrop for this. The Greek word in Hebrews 11:35 is right there for you, meaning they were tortured on the wheel or beaten to death. It's a rare verbal form of the Greek word which refers to a drum-shaped torture instrument. And in 2 Maccabees 6:19, Eleazar uses that word. He goes to that voluntarily. He's willing to be tortured in that manner to death, instead of succumbing to what the rulers want him to do. The linguistic specificity strongly suggests the author of Hebrews might have had the Maccabee martyrs in mind. Again, it's a Greek word. Anybody can use it, right? So it doesn't have to be, all the Greek words or Hebrew words in the Bible weren't previously inspired words, right? They were just words people used every day in their language. But the fact that it's a rare word that comes from Maccabees, and Maccabees would have been known, means we should ask ourselves, is that connected somehow to the text in what's going on here, if the author of Hebrews would have known all this, and this has like legendary status. Second Maccabees and the resurrection and their hope. In Hebrews 11:35, the phrase better resurrection mirrors the defiant speeches of the seven brothers. In 7:9 of 2 Maccabees, the second brother says, "The King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life." And in 2 Maccabees 7:11, the third brother, offering his hands to be cut off, says he hopes to get them back again from God. So he not only believes in a resurrection, he believes in physically receiving back a body. This is hundreds. When Christians normally talk about resurrection stuff, they think that there's none anywhere laid out. These guys clearly believed in a literal, physical, bodily resurrection, which, to jump, it might be on the next slide, I don't know, but Paul in the New Testament is the most clear on a physical, bodily resurrection. He would have known all this stuff also. All right. So some key themes that are here related to them. the voluntary death of the Maccabees, the voluntary death of Jesus, the provocation, the martyrs provoke the king's wrath. Jesus is, you can read through this here. I want to get to, there's another possible parallel right there, and then there is, so, what does, I think I probably have this at the very end on one of the last slides when I do all three, but since we're talking about it right now, what does this not do? So, when, let's see here. The idea of the resurrection that comes from the Maccabees, okay? But then, even when there's a connection with Jesus, even on the cross, the brothers of the Maccabee brothers and then Jesus. But what Maccabees has created, this idea of resurrection, okay, then the New Testament takes to a whole new level. What the Maccabees present as them being willing to be an example and sacrifice themselves, Jesus then takes to an additional level, because he's not just being an example, he moves it from example to substitution. Like, the Maccabees aren't doing that. Like, Jesus is taking it to a whole new level. So one of the things that we will see, I think in all three of these cases, if we get through them, is that what was developed in the intertestamental time period is held out as a hope of some kind, but then what the New Testament does is it takes it into a new direction that deuterocanonical book could not take it. Does that make sense? So in this time period, it creates the ideas, kind of it bubbles over from the stew of everything going on as they're trying to figure out how God and their life intersects in the situation that they're in. And as that bubbles over, these ideas come to the top, resurrection just being one. But they don't understand or have the theological connection to be able to know where that can go, and they're not saying it goes where the New Testament says it goes. They just have the concept. The New Testament then, with that concept as the background, does something different with it and takes it to a whole new place that they never could have. Does that make sense?
How do you press all of which that you didn't know? Because this is a whole different.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's.
So what do we do with all this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let me see if we can get to maybe one more text, and then we'll kind of answer that ish at the end, maybe. So this here is Jesus, just for an example. So it's the same thing as what we had in the other funnel, but it's just in a different mode here. So moving from the inside out, this is what would have framed Jesus' mind. Okay? So theologically, all right, Isaiah, Psalms, the Torah, Daniel, etc., that would have been probably the most formation building in his mind. Okay? Then you've got Galilean synagogue, all right, John the Baptist and his work, maybe the oral Torah. Then you've got the apocalyptic traditions. Each one we're moving out. So they're influential, but they're not as influential. Whatever's in the center is the most forming of what's going on in his mind. So, and then on the outside, you've got the Hellenistic, the Samaritan traditions, and the Roman imperialism. Those are all the cultures he's living in. So there's all sorts of sayings that Jesus says that are completely connected to the Roman situation that they're in, the Samaritan situation, the Hellenistic culture and situation that they're in. So all of those, I mean, most people would already say, if you read a commentary that deals with background stuff, they're already going to point to all that type of stuff. You know, when Jesus says this, this is how it connects with the culture, and because in Greek culture it meant this, or that, all this stuff comes out all the time. Well, all of that is part of what we're talking about. And so, even Jesus, which would be the most unique person to be talking about as having some background stuff, right? But everything he did, his whole ministry was not in a vacuum. He did it in a literal time and place, Just like when God shows up to Abraham, it's in a literal time and place, speaking in Abraham's language so that Abraham can understand him, right? Using not 21st century technological speak, right? But no, staffs and goats and whatever, right? Because that's what is in his time period. So it's the same thing for Jesus. All right. I know I'm flying. Wisdom of Solomon is another passage. Chapter 7, verses 22. Now, we are pulling all these partially out of context. I'll just have to admit that right now. This is a couple of verses out of a chunk of text. If you read Maccabees, it's going to take you a little while to read them. I didn't finish reading. I started to read some of these a week or two ago. Wisdom of Solomon is long. Ben Sira is long. Maccabees is fairly long. So, it's just like if we were dealing with, Philippians 4:13. We'd say, if you really want to know what it means, you need to read all of Philippians, all 4 chapters, and put it in its context, right? So we are just pulling some stuff here. So the Wisdom of Solomon, specifically chapter 7, is a cornerstone of Hellenistic Jewish thought that shaped New Testament Christology. Written in Koine Greek, it provided the conceptual vocabulary the apostles used to describe Jesus as the wisdom of God. I want to specifically highlight this because this is critical. Okay? Conceptual, sorry, you don't like that color. Conceptual vocabulary, okay? Conceptual vocabulary does not mean theological meaning. It means using vocabulary and concepts that are already in the culture, and then what they do with them, that's another question. In fact, that's one of the big takeaways I hope that we can get from this, is that much of the conceptual vocabulary was already there, resurrection for instance, but what the New Testament does with that is the theologically important issue for us as Christians. It's no big deal that the conceptual vocabulary was already there. So we're like, really? Wow, I didn't know that resurrection was already talked about prior to the New Testament. Okay, awesome. But now we do. So we can dig further into that and, what does all that mean? But it's not that the New Testament is taking this entire non-biblical book, okay? It's not that it's taking this non-biblical book and then shoving it into the Bible. And so you're like, well, how can it be non-biblical, but it's in the Bible, da da da. We're not saying that. We're saying that it's using the vocabulary of the time and the culture that we often don't realize had already been developed in between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament in those 400 years. This has already been developed then. They're taking that, and then for us, the hermeneutical question, the theological question is, what are the New Testament writers doing with this? So, what is Jesus doing, meaning, when he says this? What is Paul doing, meaning, when he says this? When the Apostle John uses logos for the word, there's a whole Hellenistic and philosophical concept related to that. My position has always been he's more connected to the Old Testament debar, that's the Hebrew word for the word in the Old Testament, more so than the logos of the Hellenistic philosophy. But there's no way that those weren't both in the environment going on. And since Hellenism had already taken such deep roots, it is for sure that when the word logos is said, that the people that hear it are understanding and they are thinking about the Hellenistic aspect of what that means. And so John is probably using both of that, even though I would push a little bit that he's also steeped in the Old Testament just as much. All right. So there's another connection that appears in the Epistle to the Hebrews. Hebrews has all sorts of connections, by the way. It comes up in every one of these passages. And then Colossians, where the author borrows specific rare terminology from Wisdom 7 to explain the relationship between the Father and the Son. So in Wisdom of Solomon 7:22 to 8:1, it says, "She is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty, a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, an image of His goodness. She reaches mightily from one end of the earth to the other, and she orders all things well." Who's the she? Wisdom. Yeah, this is wisdom. So the whole thing is talking about wisdom, which we already have in our Bible, some stuff about wisdom. And Proverbs chapter 8 is a key passage, and that is the main passage that is usually used by New Testament scholars who don't interact with deuterocanonical books. They just point to Proverbs 8. Wisdom of Solomon goes beyond Proverbs 8 in its personification, all the way to the point of personifying wisdom as Torah. And so this increased personification that occurs in this time period between Old Testament and New Testament is then a backdrop for what happens in the New Testament with wisdom. And New Testament does something that the wisdom of Solomon can't do. So here's a couple of connecting points here about the radiance of God's glory. The Greek word, you can see that's in bold there. So Wisdom 7:26 and Hebrews 1:3 are using this in a similar manner. Again, you can argue, and you should, that just because a word is used doesn't mean they're pulling it from that. So that's a valid argument. Like, you have to go do some research on that. But if it's a rare word, it's only used here and maybe one other place, then you got to ask yourself, well, the fact that he's using it here and it only occurs in these other couple of places, well, it's probably likely that it's got a connection. The mirror and image aspects that are listed here as well. Again, these will all be in the slide deck that I'll upload today or tomorrow, so you can look further at these. And then here we go with John 1:3 in the middle passage there. Through him all things were made, without him nothing was made that has been made. And connecting wisdom and Jesus there. So there's too many of these for me to go through all of them, but the summary of them is all of these that wisdom has. 7 attributes of wisdom found in chapter 7, verse 25 and 26. The breath of the power of God, His glory and mighty, the brightness of eternal light, the unspotted mirror of the working God, the image of His goodness, renewing all things, and passes through all things by reason of her pureness. So the ideas in these sentences are then taken and applied to who the true wisdom is, not Torah, but Jesus in the New Testament. And it's because of this backdrop that works for the Jewish and Greek-speaking people of that time period. So John makes the move the wisdom tradition could not make. The Word became flesh. Wisdom in Wisdom 7 is a cosmic principle, universal, mobile, penetrating all things. John locates this principle into a particular historical person at a particular historical moment. The vocabulary is inherited, but the claim is unprecedented in the tradition. So again, we're back to the idea that the concepts and vocabulary were created during this 400 years. But what the New Testament people do with them and what the theological argument they make, that is not in that 400-year time period. It's completely new, in a whole new trajectory that is going on with that. And what would John's background have been? Did I skip John? Oh, I didn't put his in there. So sorry. I had Paul's in there. So, Paul's background would have been all of these different aspects as well. Similar to Jesus, but more in some certain areas. Particularly trained as a Pharisee, an increased amount of Hellenism background as well because of the time period. And so he's still going to have key things, the whole Torah, Isaiah, Psalms. That's going to be key for anybody dealing with theology of that time period. But then the Septuagint becomes much, much stronger of an influence in his life. Early Christianity, that wouldn't have been in Jesus's because he's the one creating Christianity, right? And he's dead, buried, resurrected by the time Christianity is starting. So all of these things are fitting in. So Paul has some similar things from Jesus' background. He's got things that were not in Jesus' background. And then, of course, the Christianity part would definitely not be. The third passage was Sirach, which is from Ben Sira. This is the only deuterocanonical author who is named, self-identified, and biographically traceable. So he has a very unique and pivotal position in the debate. He's the only author who names himself, and his grandson translates his work. And so...
Where is that located?
Pardon?
Ben Sira, where is that located? Is that a book?
Yes, so this is the book. Sometimes this is listed as Ecclesiasticus, right here, or Sirach. Depends on. I think they put it as Ecclesiasticus in the Catholic Bible. So with him, so his book deals with wisdom as well. His background is listed here as well. So the difference here, okay, so Maccabees didn't write Maccabees. Okay, it was written after. Wisdom of Solomon was not written by Solomon. This was written by Ben is for son of in Hebrew, so son of Sirach. This we have evidence of who actually wrote it. So we got a real person. Their grandson translated it, etc. So it opens in chapter 44. Let us now sing the praises of famous men, our ancestors in their generations. And then what follows is the most sustained canonical retrospective in the entire pre-New Testament Jewish corpus. So he reads the Old Testament narrative from Enoch to the high priest Simon as a unified theological trajectory. So similar to what we did in our first couple of weeks, reading through the Old Testament and New Testament, we were just looking at modes of revelation. But he pretty much does that for the Old Testament and showing how God blesses and is faithful to all of these people. So it's going to be another connection with Hebrews 11 here. But he's leading up to and pointing to the high priest, Simon. So to some degree, it's an argument for the legitimacy of Simon and that high priest. Now, we didn't discuss this, but there's a whole issue that takes place related to the high priest during the time of the Maccabees and following them. And from then on for a while, the high priest is no longer from the line of Aaron, which is what it's supposed to be according to the scriptures. And so that also causes another clash within Judaism. And so just like with Greece, some go with them, some go against them, etc. When this happens, you have the same thing. Some think the priesthood has now been corrupted because it's not from Aaron's lineage. Some go along with it, etc. And so you got all these factions that develop because of this. What he cannot do is what Hebrews does. The high priest in Hebrews is a high priest unlike any others. And so what Sirach is setting up, it's not just about the high priest, but how he's reading the Old Testament, similar to how Hebrews is reading the Old Testament. But the high priest that Sirach is pointing to and the high priest that Hebrews is pointing to is two different things. But if you lived in that time period and you read Hebrews, you would have known Sirach. And you would have already known how he theologically read the Old Testament leading up to a high priest. And now you're reading Hebrews through the Old Testament leading up to a high priest. You would have caught all these connections. But the high priest in Hebrews isn't a high priest that is just human and dies. It's a high priest who is a substitute, who takes the place, who still rules and reigns, who still intercedes. That's something that, again, the intertestamental deuterocanonical literature cannot do. That's a place they can't go with their book and their high priest that they're pointing towards. And so we're kind of going to have to end. There's a couple more slides of comparisons on Sirach. And there's the Paul slide. The last couple of slides are kind of the summary of what do we do, okay, which was part of your question earlier, right? So what do we do with all of this? So DCs, deuterocanonical books, and hermeneutics. So in John, what John communicates without the background. So here's the deal. So we have to ask ourselves a couple of different questions. So as I'm going through all this, and I'm like, well, how much does this matter for interpreting? Because not everybody has read the deuterocanonical books. Not everybody has them because they're not in certain Bibles, right? Like ours. So, are they necessary for understanding the text? Now, you could ask that for anything, but most Christians haven't read the whole Bible, so, like, is Leviticus, well, Leviticus is necessary for understanding Hebrews, right? Is it necessary for you can debate, right? Like, certain books might be, quote, more important than others and all that, but in John 1, the prologue's primary theological claims cross cultural boundaries without wisdom background. So the point here is that you can take the Gospel of John anywhere, and even though it's based on Old Testament stuff and possibly some Greek philosophical content as well, people don't have to have those backgrounds in order to understand John 1. They will get that Jesus is God out of John 1. So, that's point 1. Point 2 is that if you study this other stuff, we'll just call it background stuff for now, you will get a more precise understanding. So, it's not necessary for someone to get saved, because 2,000 years makes that very clear, right? The gospel's been going out, and only parts of the Bible have been going out for thousands of years. Most of the world doesn't have the whole Bible, and when evangelism happens, except in rare cases, they are not starting with Genesis. In third world countries and tribal communities, that is what they found to be very effective in years past. Modern evangelism is heavily based just on Jesus. I would argue that there has to be some kind of a understanding of a backstory. Like, you can't just put Jesus on the table. Like, the reason Jesus came is because of everything behind it. So there has to be something explained. You can do it in a few paragraphs, but there's got to be something that explains how that connects. So the claims of John are able to be gotten without all of this. But what it adds is that the wisdom tradition shows that John is not inventing the concept of a divine personal principle operating in creation and dwelling in Israel. That concept already existed. They thought it was in Torah. There was like a divine wisdom in Torah. And I don't just mean like Torah is wisdom. I mean an additional special spiritual aspect of wisdom incorporated into it. So he inherits this category, and then he makes a specific, unprecedented, and historically particular claim within that category. And that's what he's doing. And so that's why deuterocanonical books are important, especially for us in the West who have all this time, I guess, and all these resources to better understand what's going on in the text. The departure that John makes is not replaceable. The wisdom tradition can't do that in the previous time period. Hebrews is going to be the same thing, and 1 Corinthians here with Paul and wisdom, same thing. The last couple of slides are just the text that we looked at, what it establishes, where the New Testament uses it, and where the New Testament goes beyond or exceeds how it was being used in that time frame. And there's a summary with 3 other passages as well. Look at the very bottom here, and this is how we'll close. The Deuterocanonical explains the vocabulary. The text determines the sentence. So, the New Testament books are using this vocabulary and the concepts and the thoughts that have already been created in these 400 years. But what they're doing with them is something different. And you could actually make the same case about other things that are not part of the Deuterocanonical books. Because there's other stuff that was part of that cultural time period that would be influencing, if you go back to our diagrams about what influenced all these first century people, right? All these other things were part of that backstory as well. And so that's part of what's going on here. So the end all is that, no, I don't think these are part of the inspired canon. I think they took place in that time period when that wasn't happening there. Are they necessary for understanding the core of the gospel? No. Are they necessary for understanding the nuances and the peculiarities of the biblical text? Yes, I think they are. And so that's why they become important to us. And it's kind of like, to use the biggest illustration, is that you cannot understand Hebrews if you don't know Leviticus. And it's like that, just to some level. So I hope that makes sense. Next week, we could spend 3 more weeks on this, and I know that because it's a unfamiliar topic, it really requires even more unpacking, because I'm sure a lot of it is still like a lot of questions or not sure of certain things, and I am too with some of it. But the course isn't just on this, so so next week we're going to change gears and talk about the Spirit of God, and so that'll be another fun time, and we'll see if we get through it in a week or not. I don't know, but we'll go ahead, we'll pray, and be dismissed. Glenn, why don't you pray for us?